Senate Committee on Commerce, Science, and Transportation will come to order. I appreciate members' attendance today. We're here to do an executive session on a number of bills critically important to both sides of the aisle and all of us together. First, I want to say my thoughts and prayers are with the Uvalde people of Texas, the families that were impacted, and all of those who are struggling with this horrific event. Our thoughts and prayers are with them. Today, we are going to consider legislation co-sponsored by Senators Wicker, Senator Lummis, Senator Blackburn, that would for the first time direct the Office of Science and Technology Policy and the National Science Foundation and NIST to develop a national R&D strategy to address risk opportunities to distributed ledger technologies, better known to most of us as blockchain. Our USICA bill recognizes the need to invest in cutting-edge technologies, including distributed ledgers, so I appreciate my colleagues' efforts on this effort here. The Wicker-Cantwell substitute will ensure that the national R&D strategy consider the increasing use of this technology by minority communities in conducting business. Underrepresented communities have often been ignored when it comes to thinking about these new technologies, and that will not be the case here. Next, we have the Fire Relief Nation Act by myself and Senator Sullivan. I want to thank Senator Wicker and his team for working with us on this bill. Last year, our state's wildfire burned more than 670,000 acres, 73% burned from fires started by lightning strikes. So weather is a very important aspect of predictability. Terrible fires we are witnessing today in Senator Lujan's state of New Mexico are spreading rapidly because of unexpected wind conditions. It's clear that when we are dealing with wildfire, weather matters. This bill focuses on improving forecasting abilities and accuracy on forecasters with wildland fire teams and more precisely predict fire movement in real time. It supports advances in weather technology. On the issues of compensation, I want to thank Senator Sinema. I recognize her work. She's been leading on the HISGAC committee to address compensation limits for all wildland firefighters. I know there's more to do on that, and so certainly appreciate her leadership and want to continue to work with you. Senator Peters and Lummis are co-sponsoring the Combating Human Rights Abuse Act, which we'll also consider. This bill is designed to ensure that Department of Commerce professionals are educating U.S. companies that might consider doing business in Xinjiang region about the significant human rights abuses and other ethnic minorities from the Chinese government. This bill also directs the Department of Providence guidance on ways to avoid doing business with entities under the government's influence and potential legal, economic, reputational, and other risks associated with it. We'll also be considering the Advanced Aviation Infrastructure Modernization Act by Senators Padilla and Moran. This is about how to get air mobility capacity planning for the future, and I thank them for that legislation. And finally, the Transportation Fuel Market Transparency Act. The rising prices of fuel is wreaking havoc on consumers' price book, and as we just saw yesterday with the Department of Justice filing one of the largest settlement cases in our country's history, $1.1 billion for oil market manipulation. I want to thank all of the agencies that have been working on that important case. But clearly, we could be giving them additional tools on the transparency of oil markets as it relates to the petroleum markets. As we heard from expert witnesses last month, transparency is almost on all of our commodities except for the gaping hole in the center, that was a quote, of oil and gas markets. Congress has given the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission and the Commodities Future Trading Commission ability to police bad actors, then they can be caught and punished, but we also need a policeman on the beat as it relates to the transportation fuel market. So I know we have a very full agenda this morning. I thank all the members on both sides of the aisle for being here and their busy schedules, but I would also like to express that part of this debate, I will have to, as chair, ensure that the amendments that are offered are substantially within the jurisdiction of this Commerce Committee per the Senate rules, and so as I chair, I will be obligated to rule out of order any amendments that violate this rule. So I encourage this level of debate. I know this topic has lots of issues. I would hope that as we move to the floor, these amendments would be considered there. So I thank our colleagues for considering other members' times while we debate these issues. I'll now turn to the ranking member.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and certainly we all share your views and we all share the heartache for our friends in Texas, and that will be a pall over the operations of the Senate all day and on into the future. So thank you for saying that. We're going to get a number of things of importance done today. The agenda before us reflects many months of collaborative work to advance several bipartisan bills that I'm pleased to support. In particular, we will vote on the National R&D Strategy for Distributed Ledger Technology Act to ensure that we maintain America's leadership in emerging technologies. So far, most attention to blockchain has focused on financial applications such as cryptocurrencies. Yet this focus overlooks its potential to transform our information systems to be more efficient, transparent, and secure across our supply chain and government operations and more. I'm pleased to have Senator Lummis and Blackburn join me as co-sponsors of this important legislation. This bill would accelerate the impact of decades of publicly funded research in computing and cryptography. With regard to S 4217, the Transportation Fuel Market Transparency Act, for decades when gas prices have spiked, the Federal Trade Commission has been asked to identify price gouging or manipulation in the oil and gas market. And each time the FTC has found nothing. Today, with gas prices hitting record highs, instead of reckoning with how the president's own anti-domestic energy policies are contributing to this crisis, the president is looking for a scapegoat. This bill would do just that. The distinguished chair has pointed out that the Justice Department announced action being taken just yesterday. So apparently the Justice Department does not need additional legislation to take the action that they've taken. This bill before us, which I cannot support, would empower the FTC to harass more small businesses and individuals, but it would do nothing to provide relief to the American people. I want to acknowledge that Senator Cantwell has agreed to accept modified versions of my amendments. And while I appreciate the work we were able to do in these issues, we really are not there yet. I still believe the bill is fundamentally flawed and will therefore be voting no on that legislation. I'll yield back to you, my friend.
Thank you. I'll now recognize Senator Klobuchar for a motion.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I move that S 4217, the Transportation Fuel Market Transparency Act, as amended by Wicker 1 as modified, Wicker 2 as modified, Wicker 3 as modified, and Wicker 4 as modified, be favorably reported.
Is there a second? All those in favor say aye. No, wait, yeah, right.
The motion failed for lack of a second.
No, he seconded it. It's just he's not reporting. He's saying reported instead. Okay, there will be 2 minutes of discussion for each of the amendments offered. Is there any discussion? Senator Lee.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Shortly, I'll be calling up the Lee amendments number 37, number 28, and number 36 to S 4217. But I do want to speak for just a moment before doing that about some of these issues. We've got rising gas prices that are being borne heavily by many American families, and lower middle class and rural Americans who are feeling the incredible punch to the gut every time they fill up their gas tank, if in fact they can afford to even fill it up all the way. The national and the Utah gas prices average around $4.60 per gallon and are projected to rise even higher in the coming months. Our rising gas prices today reflect shock waves that provide a snapshot of the volatility of energy markets and terrible regulatory policies and decisions and the substantial market uncertainty of the future. Americans are struggling to cope with these prices on top of an economy that's already experiencing massive systemic inflation. President Biden, for his part, has continued to point fingers at everyone else, everyone and everything else except his own policies, telling us to pay no attention to that man behind the curtain. But the reality remains that President Biden's crusade against reliable domestic energy sources has largely resulted in our current state of high energy prices. Let's take just a quick look back at the signals that the Biden administration has sent to the industry that the Biden administration itself accuses of hiking, has sent to the industry of hiking prices. During his campaign, then presidential candidate Joe Biden guaranteed what he referred to, quote unquote, as the end of fossil fuels. In January of 2021, shortly after he took office, immediately, in fact, President Biden issued an executive order to stop all oil and gas leasing on federal land. President Biden's Securities and Exchange Commission has proposed new regulations to weaponize publicly traded companies against traditional energies. President Biden accused oil and gas companies of price gouging without evidence, despite the fact that energy prices skyrocketed after he took office as a result of his policies. After all this, the White House has actively lobbied OPEC rather than the United States to increase oil production. Now, just recently, Gina McCarthy stated, quote, President Biden remains absolutely committed to not moving forward with additional drilling on public lands, close quote. Last week in a hearing, when I asked if she agreed with that assessment, Secretary Haaland, whose department, the Department of the Interior, oversees drilling on public lands, responded, quote, I don't know. I have plenty of other examples that I could point to, but instead of looking to address these negative signals and misguided regulatory policies that are sending energy markets into a tailspin, the administration, as well as the Senate and House Democrats, are suggesting that the solution is to have more government micromanagement of our markets and that gas prices will somehow come down if we just empower more federal bureaucrats to look over your shoulder. In fact, the House Democrats just passed legislation that astoundingly would give the federal government the power to enact what I can only call price controls on gasoline. The failed energy policies of the 1970s are calling, and congressional Democrats are answering with the same destructive policies that led to sharp price increases, gas shortages, and long lines at the pump. And while price controls are an absolutely absurd and destructive policy position, today's legislation contains concerning policies that would cause further harm to this already volatile market. The bill before us contains a number of provisions that could empower the Federal Trade Commission with sweeping rulemaking powers to regulate vast swaths of the economy and investigate an undefined term, quote, suspicious behavior, close quote. What could go wrong? Increase and expand the data producing burdens that companies already have and make it easier to assess penalties on energy companies that run afoul of the numerous ambiguous definitions in this bill. Now, the FTC currently has the authority, already got the authority and has for a decade and a half to look into these issues in the oil and gas market, and it has in fact investigated before. But it's never found evidence of wrongdoing to justify the expanded use of this authority that this bill grants, especially when the terms are so ambiguous that it'd provide potentially unlimited government authority, discretion even, over this industry. This is no solution for the American people who are longing for the restoration of certainty in the market so that gas prices can be lowered. It's for that reason that I'm proud to join a number of my colleagues today who, all of us combined, have offered over 50 energy policy solutions to this legislation. These solutions would increase U.S. energy production, restore regulatory certainty, push back on the harmful signals coming from the administration, and ensure that Americans can afford their energy costs in the future. I won't be calling up every one of those amendments today, but I would like to call up three. And I'd like to start by calling up Lee Amendment number 37 to S 4217.
Senator Lee, this amendment would prohibit the Securities and Exchange Commission from implementing a proposed rule relating to the registration statements and annual reports, which is not germane to this bill, falls out of the jurisdiction of the Senate committee and is on this committee and is the Senate Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs Committee.
Madam Chair, point of inquiry, could you tell me what rule of the committee or what rule of the Senate you're relying on in concluding that this is out of order? I mean, keeping in mind that this is a bill that does deal to a very significant
think
degree in
all our
significant ways with
colleagues-
the energy industry.
I think all our colleagues know what is in other committees' jurisdiction, and this is clearly, from the parliamentarian's perspective, the Senate Committee on Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs. So the committee, this amendment is out of order. I'd like to recognize
I
other
appeal the
people.
ruling of the chair.
Pardon me?
I appeal the ruling of the chair.
Okay. The question before us then is whether the chair should be overturned. And I obviously don't think so, because this is not our jurisdiction. And I know that our colleagues feel, pent up about some of these issues. My colleague and I serve on the Energy Committee together. I'm sure that we'll have plenty of time to talk about these issues in the Energy Committee. So the question is, will the ruling of the chair be overturned? And the clerk will call the roll.
Madam Chair, could I have 10 seconds to explain my position on this? I mean, look, you opened the door to energy policy with this bill. This bill deals with energy policy in meaningful ways. You open that door. If this bill is in order within this committee, so too should my amendment.
Well, Senator Lee, look, I respect that you file many amendments all the time. And I would say
Is there
that,
something wrong with that?
no, I'm saying that, you and I have had many conversations about considering those amendments, and we consider many of them. I would say that one of the hallmarks of this committee is that we are moving legislation, and we are doing so in a regular order fashion. But one thing that will stop us from moving things in regular order fashion is when we start taking other people's jurisdiction and passing it through this committee. So I would like to keep the integrity of our committee, and I ask my colleagues to vote no on overturning the chair. Clerk will call the roll.
Mrs. Klobuchar?
No.
Mr. Blumenthal?
No by proxy.
Mr. Schatz? No. Mr. Markey? No. Mr. Peters? No. Ms. Baldwin? No. Ms. Duckworth? No. Mr. Tester? No. Ms. Sinema? No. Ms. Rosen? No. Mr. Lujan? No. Mr. Hickenlooper? No. Mr. Warnock? No. Mr. Wicker?
Aye.
Mr. Thune?
Aye.
Mr. Blunt?
Aye by proxy.
Mr. Cruz?
Aye by proxy.
Mrs. Fisher? Mr. Moran?
Aye by proxy.
Mr. Sullivan? Mrs. Blackburn? Mr. Young?
Aye by proxy.
Mr. Lee?
Aye.
Mr. Johnson?
Aye by proxy.
Mrs. Capito?
Aye by proxy.
Mr. Scott? Ms. Lummis? Mrs. Cantwell?
No.
The ayes are 14, the noes are 14.
The ruling of the chair is not overturned.
Madam Chair?
Senator, I would like to go back and forth if it's possible. Senator Hickenlooper?
Where's that? Here we go. Madam Chairwoman, I would like to call up Hickenlooper 1 as modified as an amendment to S4217, the Transportation Fuel Market Transparency Act. Americans are feeling the pain at the pump, partly because supply shortages from the pandemic, but also Putin's war on Ukraine. America is an energy superpower. We have the short and long-term resources to combat high prices, help our European allies, and weaken Putin. Long-term, we need to double down on clean energy. It's what China is doing while we're asleep at the wheel. They've rocketed past the U.S. and the EU in wind and solar. In short term, until we catch up, we need more domestic production. U.S. shale wells can start producing quickly. They produce most of their energy in the first few years. President Biden is already releasing 1 million barrels per day over 6 months from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve to help lower costs, and that's good. But the Strategic Petroleum Reserve is essential to our energy security long term. My amendment would commit the federal government to refill the Strategic Petroleum Reserve with oil from American companies when oil prices drop below $70 a barrel, whenever that is. It would exclude from eligibility any companies found guilty by the FTC of price gouging. It would allow us in short order to boost domestic production, get barrels to Europe to help our allies, lower prices at the pump for Americans, and hurt Putin by cutting into his profits. Chairwoman Cantwell, I've appreciated your attention to our recent discussion of this amendment. I look forward to working with you to further improve it for consideration on the Senate floor. With that, I withdraw Hickenlooper 1 and yield back to the chair.
Thank you, Senator. It is not, I appreciate the senator's good work here. This, too, is not in the jurisdiction of our committee. Look forward to working with him on this important issue that is the jurisdiction of the Energy Committee. Okay, further amendments. Senator Lee.
Madam Chair, I'd like to call up amendment number 28. This is an amendment that would prohibit the president from unilaterally issuing moratoria on new oil and gas leases or permits to drill on federal land unless authorized by an act of Congress. This is yet another issue that is plaguing the American energy industry. And here again, when you introduce legislation, as yours does, that significantly impacts the energy industry, it's not fair to conclude that we've got jurisdiction over this bill and then not allow us to vote on amendments dealing with issues necessarily brought up, raised by your legislation. And so I ask for a roll call vote.
Senator, this is also not the jurisdiction of this committee. It is the jurisdiction of the Energy Committee, and so it is not in order.
Madam Chair,
Yes.
I think that Senator from Utah has a good point. This, and my understanding is this does amend statutes that are under the jurisdiction of the Energy Committee. And by doing that, you have opened the door to consideration of amendments that would also address the issue at hand. My understanding is this isn't something we haven't done before. I think this was done. We also had amendments that were considered, offered, and I think approved when we considered the USICA legislation here before the Senate Commerce Committee.
I guarantee you this, the senator's amendment is about leasing, and I certainly appreciate any debate on the Senate floor when we move this bill to that discussion.
Madam Chair?
Senator Lee.
If I could point out, the second half of this bill deals a lot with amending the EIA, the Energy Information Administration, also within the jurisdiction of the Energy and Natural Resources Committee. So again, open the door. It's we've got to take in what comes with it. And the chair has yet to cite a single rule of this committee or of the Senate that would say that it's okay for us to bring up this bill, which brings up other matters within the jurisdiction of another committee, but not amendments that you don't like.
No, Senator Lee, I appreciate your interest in having these issues debated. The committee does have jurisdiction over the FTC. This bill amends the FTC authority to have more transparency in oil markets so that we can make sure that oil market manipulation doesn't happen. That is the jurisdiction of this committee, and it was sent to this committee by the parliamentarian. The issues of communication through the FTC on information gathering, whether it's the CFTC, we're not going to consider all of these rules as it relates to the CFTC this morning. We're going to continue on what is the jurisdiction of this committee, and I think most people understand that leasing, as we have been implored by our energy colleagues not to consider this legislation. Clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Klobuchar?
No.
Mr. Blumenthal?
No by proxy.
No by proxy.
Mr. Schatz? Mr. Markey? Mr. Peters? Ms. Baldwin? Ms. Duckworth? Mr. Tester? Ms. Sinema? Ms. Rosen? Mr. Lujan? Mr. Hickenlooper? Mr. Warnock? Mr. Wicker?
Aye.
Mr. Thune?
Aye.
Mr. Blunt?
Aye by proxy.
Mr. Cruz?
Aye by proxy.
Mrs. Fisher? Mr. Moran?
Aye by proxy.
Mr. Sullivan? Mrs. Blackburn? Mr. Young?
Aye by proxy.
Mr. Lee? Mr. Johnson?
Aye by proxy.
Mrs. Capito?
Aye by proxy.
Mr. Scott? Ms. Lummis? Ms. Cantwell?
No.
The noes are 14, the yeses are 14.
The ruling of the chair is not overturned. Further amendments? Any that are in order would be great. Yes, Senator Scott.
I have three comments and amendments. I would like to call up Scott Amendment 1. This amendment requires that all pending applications for federal energy authorization, including leases and permits on federal lands, be acted on within 60 days. And if the application is denied, a detailed reason must be submitted to Congress. My amendment would help boost domestic energy production by requiring this administration to act on all outstanding permit applications. We must make America energy independent again and bring prices down for American families. That's why I urge all my colleagues to support this common sense amendment.
Senator, this also is not in the jurisdiction of this committee, so look forward to any discussion on the floor about it.
Chair Cantwell.
Yes.
So I respectfully disagree and move to appeal the ruling of the chair. I mean, I think we've had sort of this conversation. The underlying bill is about energy prices. We all know that making America energy independent, again, will bring down prices for American families. So I'd like to do this today. So
Clerk will call the roll. Clerk will call the roll, please.
Ms. Klobuchar?
No.
Mr. Blumenthal?
No by proxy.
Mr. Schatz? No. Mr. Markey?
Nope.
Mr. Peters?
Nope.
Ms. Baldwin? No. Ms. Duckworth?
No.
Mr. Tester?
No.
Ms. Sinema?
No.
Ms. Rosen? No. Mr. Lujan? No. Mr. Hickenlooper? Mr. Warnock? No. Mr. Wicker?
Aye.
Mr. Thune?
Aye.
Mr. Blunt?
Aye by proxy.
Mr. Cruz?
Aye by proxy.
Mrs. Fisher? Mr. Moran?
Aye by proxy.
Mr. Sullivan? Mrs. Blackburn? Mr. Young?
Aye by proxy.
Mr. Lee? Mr. Johnson?
Aye by proxy.
Mrs. Capito?
Aye by proxy.
Mr. Scott?
Aye.
Ms. Lemus?
Aye.
Ms. Cantwell?
No.
The noes are 14, the yeses are 14.
Ruling of
Sure.
the chair is not overturned.
Chair Cantwell.
Scott.
I would like to call up my amendment, Scott 9. My amendment simply calls for a geo study on the rise in domestic energy prices since January of 2021, which includes all policies, guidelines, or regulations implemented by this administration and how those policies have impacted domestic energy prices. Before we grant the FTC more authority, I think it's a good idea to first study what policies got us here in the first place. My amendment would do just that, and I ask all my colleagues to support.
This amendment also is not within the jurisdiction of this committee, so I'm ruling it out of order. And would you like a vote on this?
Please.
On overturning the ruling of the chair?
Madam Chair?
Yes, Senator Markey.
I thank you, Madam Chair. And I agree with your ruling on this, that it's not within the purview of this committee. But I also think it's important for us to note that right now, the oil and gas industry has 9,000 unused onshore permits on federal lands, and they're not drilling on them. And they have 1,500 unused offshore permits on federal lands, and the oil and gas industry is not using them. And they have 4,000 partially drilled wells. Right now, they're not using them. It's the size of Indiana that they're not drilling on right now, even as they shed crocodile tears about their inability to drill. They already have all these lands, and they're not drilling, and the American people are suffering because they are not drilling for the oil and gas on those lands. So I agree with your parliamentary observation that it's not within our jurisdiction, but I also think it's important to have a panoramic view so the Republican Party can see that the oil and gas industry is actually letting down the American people with the leases that they are not using right now.
Madam Chair.
Thank you.
The distinguished senator from Massachusetts was recognized to speak about the parliamentary question. But let me just take a second or two to say that if he is suggesting that the Biden administration has not gone to war against domestic oil and gas production, then he is sadly mistaken, and every American realizes that.
Clerk will call the roll on overturning the chair.
Ms. Klobuchar?
No.
Mr. Blumenthal?
No.
Mr. Schatz? No. Mr. Markey? No. Mr. Peters? No. Ms. Baldwin? No. Ms. Duckworth? No. Mr. Tester? Ms. Sinema? Ms. Rosen? Mr. Lujan? Mr. Hickenlooper? Mr. Warnock? Mr. Wicker?
Aye.
Mr. Thune?
Aye.
Mr. Blunt?
Aye by proxy.
Mr. Cruz?
Aye by proxy.
Mrs. Fisher? Mr. Moran?
Aye by proxy.
Mr. Sullivan? Mrs. Blackburn? Mr. Young?
Aye by proxy.
Mr. Lee? Mr. Johnson?
Aye by proxy.
Mrs. Capito?
Aye by proxy.
Mr. Scott?
Aye.
Ms. Lemus? Ms. Cantwell? The noes are 14, the yeses are 14.
The ruling of the chair is not overturned.
Chair Cantwell.
Yes,
My
Senator
last
Scott.
amendment. I don't think this is clearly about the FTC, so hopefully we'll get through on this one. This is Scott 10. My amendment would require the FTC to submit a report on the enforcement actions the FTC has made against market manipulation of gas prices. If there is an urgent need to expand the FTC's authority in this space, it would be helpful to know their actions with this authority in the past. It's my understanding the FTC has not used this authority before. I urge all my colleagues to support this common sense amendment.
Senator Scott, thank you for this amendment. It is within the jurisdiction of this committee. I'm asking the senator, is it your intent, line 1 strikes the enforcement provisions of this bill? I'm more than happy to have a report, but I'm not happy to strike the main provisions of the bill. Is that your intent?
Mine is to submit a report.
Is he Senator, are you willing to strike line 1? If so, I'm happy to accept your
Oh,
amendment.
absolutely.
Okay, with this modification, striking line 1 of Scott 10, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed? Amendment is adopted. Further amendment.
Madam Chair.
Senator Sullivan.
Madam Chair, I also want to raise some issues that relate to this very important topic on energy that, again, some of the agenda that we're focused on is today, and the committee is focused on. And in particular, I have 4 amendments that I'd like to raise to the committee that address directly the issue that the President, Secretary of Energy, are doing all they can to bring down energy prices, increase supply. All due respect to them, that's actually not true at all. So what I'm putting forward, Madam Chair, are common sense amendments that will actually increase supply. I agree with Senator Markey. We need a panoramic view of what's happening. I agree with Senator Hickenlooper that we are the world's energy superpower, but we need to be able to produce. So I am calling up Sullivan 1, Sullivan 6, Sullivan 9, and Sullivan 10. And let me just begin with Sullivan 10. This is a very common sense reform to the recent Council on Environmental Quality order that will undoubtedly require the implementation of infrastructure projects under NEPA to be delayed, determining that we infrastructure country. Recently, I'd like to kill American infrastructure on the slide, new roads, bridges. I'd like to submit this for the record. And this is an issue that goes to the working men and women of America. So often, my friends on the other side of the aisle, when they have a choice between supporting far-left environmental groups who don't want to build anything and the men and women in this country who do build things, they support the coastal elites and environmental groups. This is the head of the labor's.
Madam Chair.
This is the head of the
Madam Chair.
labor's.
Senator,
Point of personal privilege. Dan Sullivan is my friend, and I would just like him to dial down the rhetoric a little bit. We're here, we're in person. This committee has a tradition of bipartisanship and friendship. There's a way to make your point that you just did. Thank you.
Madam Chair, Senator Schatz is my friend, but the issue I'm raising is a very serious one. And I believe it wholeheartedly, and I see it every day in my state. Every darn day in my state. And the people I represent see it every day, and they're being hurt. So I'm trying to do what I was elected to do, which was defend the interests of Alaska and defend the interests of the working men and women of this country. Here's the president of the Labor's International Union, Terry O'Sullivan, on this NEPA rule that I would like to have a vote on to rescind. Quote, the rollback of updates to the NEPA reinstate burdensome requirements that will cause excessive permit delays and allow project adversaries to use frivolous lawsuits to disrupt or upend long overdue construction. Once again, communities in need of vital infrastructure and the hard-working men and women who build America will be waiting as project details are subjected to onerous reviews. Americans will continue to bear the expense of NEPA-related delays, which cost taxpayers millions of dollars annually. Lengthy review processes and unpredictable legal challenges also have a chilling impact on private investment in infrastructure. That's the head of the laborers union. My amendment is simple. It would rescind the final rule recently promulgated by the Council of Economic Quality on the implementation of NEPA as it relates to infrastructure projects. This committee, and I was one of them, voted for the bipartisan infrastructure bill. The new rules put out by the White House are going to make the implementation of infrastructure, oil, gas, wind, solar, hydro, geothermal, much more difficult. My amendment is simple: to rescind that rule that's going to undermine the building of infrastructure for the men and women of this country. I ask for the yeas and nays.
Senator, your intention, you just want the vote on the First Amendment, is that correct? Or you
No,
called all of them
I'm
up?
gonna,
Do you
Madam
want
Chair.
en bloc or just that First Amendment?
Madam Chair, I am going to call for a vote on one, that
Okay,
one.
thank you.
The others, out of respect for my colleagues here, I'm going to mention, and I'm not going to call for a vote on, but I'm going to mention because I want people on this committee and in this body to know what's happening every darn day to the state of Alaska under this administration. So I'm going to raise those. I'm not going to ask for a vote on it, but I'm going to ask for a vote on this amendment.
Thank you, Senator Sullivan. And I appreciate, this is one of the reasons I'd like to get this bill to the floor, because we could have this discussion and we could have a more robust discussion on all of these bills. And I know my colleagues, this unfortunately is not in our jurisdiction, it's in the jurisdiction of EPW. I know our colleague from EPW isn't here at the moment, but I guarantee you they know it's their authority. So it is out of order. If the senator would like a vote on that, then the clerk will call the roll on overruling the chair.
Madam Chair, I appreciate a vote on this amendment.
Thank you. Clerk will call the roll.
Just to be
Ms. Klobuchar?
clear, we are voting on overruling the chair.
Yes.
Mr. Blumenthal? No. Mr. Schatz? No. Mr. Markey? No. Mr. Peters? No. Ms. Baldwin? No. Ms. Duckworth? No. Mr. Tester? No. Ms. Sinema? No. Ms. Rosen? No. Mr. Lujan? No. Mr. Hickenlooper? Mr. Warnock? No. Mr. Wicker?
Aye.
Mr. Thune?
Aye.
Mr. Blunt?
Aye by proxy.
Mr. Cruz?
Aye by proxy.
Mrs. Fisher? Aye. Mr. Moran?
Aye by proxy.
Mr. Sullivan?
Aye.
Mrs. Blackburn? Aye. Mr. Young?
Aye by proxy.
Mr. Lee? Mr. Lee? Aye. Mr. Johnson?
Aye by proxy.
Mrs. Capito?
Aye by proxy.
Mr. Scott?
Aye by proxy.
Ms. Lummis?
Aye by proxy.
Ms. Cantwell?
No.
Ms. Klobuchar?
No by proxy.
The noes are 14, the ayes are 14.
Madam Chair,
Yes.
I would like to just briefly comment on my other three amendments, which I will not call up for a vote. But I think Sullivan 9 applies deadlines for certain environmental reviews under NEPA. This is a very simple, again, amendment that goes to the infrastructure that we all need in this country. Today, the average EIS is over 600 pages long, takes almost 4 years, with a quarter of EISs taking more than 6.5 years in our country. If anyone thinks that's good for building infrastructure, I would strongly disagree. My amendment simply says that environmental assessments need to be completed in 1 year, and environmental impact statements need to be completed in 2. This is what almost every other industrialized democracy does. Unfortunately, we have a permitting system that's broken. I hope that at some point I can work with my colleagues in a bipartisan way to address these important issues.
Thank you.
The second amendments that I wanted to mention briefly, Madam Chair, Sullivan 1 and Sullivan 6. This goes directly to the issue of more energy supply for America, which is what we need. Last week, the Secretary of Energy said we are doing all we can to move energy supplies to get energy to the market in America. With respect to her, Madam Chair, that's not true. Just in the last 4 weeks, in my state, the state of Alaska, the Biden administration has announced they're taking over half of the National Petroleum Reserve of Alaska off the table for any kind of development. This is an area of Alaska set aside by Congress decades ago for oil and gas drilling. It's not ANWR, it's not an area that's controversial. And yet this administration, after a visit by Secretary Haaland, said that we're going to take half of this prolific energy basin in America off the table. It makes 0 sense. The Native people who live there are very supportive of this. Everybody's supportive of this. America's supportive of this. And 4 weeks ago, this administration said, nope, the biggest basin in America, we're going to cut in half, bigger than the state of Indiana. The second amendment, Sullivan 6, which is even more egregious. We have another basin of oil and gas development that has never been controversial in anyone's eyes. It's called the Cook Inlet Basin. It serves South Central Alaska with natural gas. That's all it does. It also produces oil. 2 weeks ago, this administration, with no warning to anybody, said we're going to cancel the federal lease sale in Cook Inlet. No reason. They came up with a reason that was false. They said there was, quote, no industry interest. That's fundamentally untrue. I've talked to the industry in our state. These impact the people I represent, these decisions, very negatively, and they go exactly against what the president's been saying about we're doing all we can to increase energy supply and bring down energy prices. That is not true. I see it every day in Alaska, and if I'm getting a little upset about this with my colleagues here, you can understand why. The people I represent are being targeted. This administration has issued 25 executive orders and executive actions solely focused on the great state of Alaska. 25. If any of you had a Republican administration that was doing something like that and you came to me and said, hey, Dan, could you help me? Could you tell them to lay off? I would help you.
1 minute.
This is happening daily in Alaska. It's why I get upset. I'm going to withdraw these amendments.
Thank you,
But I
Senator.
sure would appreciate some help from my colleagues on this war on my state.
Thank you.
Madam Chair?
I would ask that the vote on the Klobuchar motion to pass the bill be subject to further amendment.
Object.
Madam Chair,
Senator Lee.
I'd like to call up my amendment, number 36. This
So
amendment,
for the purpose of members, I would like to finish the committee's business and give anybody the opportunity to continue to speak. But we do have votes coming up shortly, and we do have members who also have other committee obligations in which they are chairing hearings. So if that's acceptable to the minority, I would like to.
Well, Madam Chair, there are a number of motions that would carry with voice votes in this committee on legislation that we've worked on for months and even years. I would suggest that if we'd like to actually have a product coming from this markup, we move to those. But I'm not going to, I will object to truncating this debate
We're not.
on the legislation that is now before us. This is theater, Madam Chair. And we're both sides are making their point. The chances of this bill being enacted in this Senate before the end of the year are remote. And part of the reason is that we've had precious little discussion about it This was placed on the agenda in a very hasty method, contrary to the long-standing practices of this committee, both under Republican and Democratic leadership. And I am not going to acquiesce to proceeding to reporting a bill that has not yet been fully voted on and where motions to place this on the record have not yet been had. And so I do object.
Well, Senator Wicker, as you know, we've had a hearing on this legislation. It has been out there for some time period. The issue has been out there, and our committee's history on this has been out there. So the issue before us today is whether the FTC should have every tool possible to make sure that oil market manipulation in the petroleum sector is properly transparent. And as we can see from both testimony before this committee and other incidents of price manipulation, of product manipulation, that this is a very important issue to the committee. The remaining issues, I believe, are not in the order of jurisdiction of this committee. And while we are happy to continue to hear those points, I'm simply trying to get the work done before we lose our quorum. Now, if it's the intent that the minority doesn't want us to finish this work today, obviously that could be your intent. But for the public deserves to know that we are fighting for transparency in oil markets, and that transparency, just as our Attorney General and every agency, the Department of Justice, the CFTC, and others are doing, that we are also making sure that there is transparency in these markets. So I would ask my colleagues if there are further amendments. Most of, like as I said, they're non-germane. I'm happy to stay here and discuss them, as often the practice in any committee, but ask my colleagues, for the benefit of all our colleagues who gathered here, to move the rest of this legislation. So,
Madam Chair, to that end, I had a third amendment I wanted to vote on. In the interest of moving it forward, if you'll give me 30 seconds to talk about it, I'll not seek a vote on that. Okay. Amendment 36 calls for the administration, the president, to be willing to allow drilling on at least 80% of the lands deemed appropriate for that. The administration, after backing away nominally from its oil and gas leasing moratorium, having lifted it only after a court order told them they had to, then said that they were restoring it on onshore leasing only with respect to 20% of the eligible lands, and then they increased the royalties by 50%. So this is claiming to lift it while not really lifting it. My amendment would undo that. I understand you've made the ruling, and I disagree with the ruling, and I'm not going to ask for a vote on this, but I would ask the chair, is the EIA within the jurisdiction of this committee? You keep talking about the FTC, but this deals with the EIA also. Is the EIA within the jurisdiction of this committee?
The underlying bill requires information from the CFTC, MOUs and partnerships on information that it gathers today, and says to seek other information. They would be part of that information. With that, I ask that the vote on the Klobuchar amendment motion to pass the bill subject to further amendment. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed?
No, and I request a roll call vote.
Clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Klobuchar?
Aye.
Mr. Blumenthal? Aye. Mr. Schatz? Aye. Mr. Markey? Aye. Mr. Peters? Aye. Ms. Baldwin? Aye. Ms. Duckworth? Aye. Mr. Tester? Aye. Ms. Sinema? Aye. Ms. Rosen? Aye. Mr. Lujan? Aye. Mr. Hickenlooper? Aye. Mr. Warnock? Aye. Mr. Wicker?
No.
Mr. Thune? No. Mr. Blunt?
No by proxy.
Mr. Cruz?
No by proxy.
Mrs. Fisher? Mr. Moran?
No by proxy.
Mr. Sullivan? Mrs. Blackburn?
No by proxy.
Mr. Young?
No by proxy.
Mr. Lee? Mr. Johnson?
No by proxy.
Mrs. Capito?
No by proxy.
Mr. Scott?
No by proxy.
Ms. Lemus?
No by proxy.
Ms. Cantwell?
Aye.
The ayes are 14, the noes are 14.
The floor will be notified of the tie vote in the committee. Senator Wicker, I recognize you for a motion.
Madam Chair, I move that S4109, the National R&D Strategy for Distributed Ledger Technology Act of 2022 as amended by the Wicker-Cantwell substitute, as amended by Lee 1 and Lee 2. S 4237, the Fire Ready Nation Act of 2022 as amended by Lee 1, Lee 2, and as modified Lujan 1, as modified Rosen 1, as modified Rosen 3, Scott 2, as modified, and Wicker 1. S 4246, the Advanced Aviation Infrastructure Modernization Act as amended by Lee 1 as modified, and Moran 1 as modified, be favorably reported.
Is there a second? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. The ayes have it, and the bills have been reported. I think that concludes our business today. I will recognize any member who wishes to speak about additional agenda items. I want to thank all the members for their participation today. I remain committed to this committee's process, and I appreciate our colleagues' attendance.
Madam Chair.
Still need to do that one. Oh, sir. I guess we did miss one motion on the combating S41-101.
I'm focusing.
Madam Chair,
Yes, Senator Wicker.
I move that S 4101, the Combating Human Rights Act of 2022, be reported favorably without amendment.
Go out in the hall. It's, is there a second? Second. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. The ayes have it, the bill has been reported. Now I would like to turn to any members who want to wish.
Madam Chair.
I thank the Senator Wicker and the minority for their participation today. Senator Rosen.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Today's markup of the Fire Ready Nation Act, it's an important step in our nation's efforts to prepare and protect ourselves from the threat of wildfires. Senator Cantwell, your leadership in crafting and moving this bill through, it's been vital. In my state of Nevada, and especially in the West, we know the dangers and destruction from wildfire emergencies all too well. I'm proud to co-sponsor today's bill, which would establish a fire weather services program within the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. This first-of-its-kind resource will do invaluable good as a tool to track and protect against wildfires. This bill also includes several provisions in line with my Fire Act to ensure greater cohesion between NOAA officials and wildfire response units. I'm also proud to see that my amendments to direct NOAA to better collect data during wildfires and to place a greater focus on monitoring wildfire and smoke levels at impacted sites has been incorporated into this legislation. I'm proud to see us move forward in a bipartisan way to protect our communities against wildfires, and I look forward to continuing to work with you all on this critically important issue. I yield.
Thank you. Further comments? Senator Moran.
Chairwoman, thank you very much. I thank you and Ranking Member Wicker and other members of the committee for the passage of the Advanced Aviation Infrastructure Modernization Act just moments ago. This legislation establishes a pilot planning grant program at the FAA to help prepare federal agencies for anticipated advanced air mobility operations. I just want to take this opportunity to express my gratitude to the committee for advancing this cause.
Thank you, Senator Moran. Any further comments? If not, we're adjourned.